Lili by Martin Sanders Whiteley. Chapter 15. Clarissa's Story. Clarissa was much changed since I had seen her last. Everything about her had darkened and hardened with experience. Her dress was dirty and ragged. The fingers had fallen off of her gloves, aside from the pointer finger of the right-hand glove, which was hanging on by one desperate thread, allowing her long, sharp fingernails to cast reflections of the moon where they weren't covered by dirt. The heels had also broken off of her shoes. Indeed, shortly after I noticed this, she took her shoes off, throwing them out of the circle where they were swallowed by fog. One wolf, which had a coat that was almost white, yelped in surprise as a shoe landed behind him. An older, grayer wolf turned briefly and snarled at the younger wolf, who sat very still and made no sound. Clarissa's eyes had hardened. They were like marble, but spoke of more understanding of the world than any statue could hope to possess. She reared her head back, letting out a full-throated scream that sounded like no wolf I had ever heard, but was full of animal wildness and human rage. The wolves began to disappear into the graying fog, some howling as they faded into the distant haze. When all the wolves had gone, the fog began to recede from the forest, moving like the shadow of a giant's hands, which had covered us until this point. Now it was only us. "I thought I'd never find you," said Clarissa, breaking the gentle silence that had settled on us in spite of the howling. Her voice was unchanged, but covered in a layer of grime. "I suppose the others told you what happened." I nodded. "I've also learned how to change. I was surprised how easy it was, especially when I was angry." Clarissa nodded in agreement, then sat on a nearby tree stump, looking at the sky in thought. "I was probably too angry and preoccupied to be surprised, actually," she mused, probably talking to herself more than me. Then she looked up at me again. "You're wondering about the wolves," she said. "I am, yes." I wondered if she had read my mind, or it was just a good guess. Clarissa took a deep breath, and then began to speak again. "After I killed those people, I was still brimming with a million emotions. The anger and defensiveness was still in me, but it was mixed with my past fear and regret. At a complete loss as to what to do, I retreated to the woods. I wandered an endless onslaught of trees, all of which seemed the same for a long time. Eventually I reached a clearing. In the clearing was a cottage, straight out of a fairy story. It was made of bricks that were a dull red, with a thatched roof and a chimney of the same red brick. A stream of gray smoke glided out of the chimney into the freedom of the night air. Initially, my mind told me not to go inside. This was the kind of cottage that lured the innocent to their death. Then I remembered that I was not the innocent. I saw that the door had been left open. I crept towards it, trying not to make any noise. To no avail. Contrary to tradition, the owners of the cottage were not away. A group of average-looking men stood before me. A few were older, a bit burlier, and had beards. The others were younger and had only the beginnings of beards. There was something tragic about all of their faces, but there was little time to concern myself with that. "Get the guns!" one of the older ones shouted. It was then that I realized that I was still a wolf. I let out the most ferocious snarl I could muster. I let my wolf fur melt into a tangled mess of hair and let it fall over my face for a more intimidating effect. I quickly slithered into an upright position and curled my hand around the throat of the man who had called for the guns. I could feel my eyes burning and my lips curving into a sadistic smile. The man, gasping for breath, made a vague gesture with his hand for the others to put the guns back. They quickly did so, then ran back, wide-eyed and grinning. "Sorry about that," one of the younger ones boomed in a loud, hearty voice. "What?" I said out loud. This wasn't what I had expected. My eyes dimmed and the grin fell from my face. I felt like I shrank a little bit. I dropped the man. The man landed on his knees. He coughed for a moment, catching his breath while clutching his knees. Then he stood up, the same giddy grin the others were wearing plastered on his face. "We didn't know you were like us," he exclaimed. "What do you mean?" I responded, trying to maintain an intimidating front. "Come sit by the fire," the man offered. "We can explain everything." I was hesitant to go with them at first, but I decided I would. If they turned on me at any point, I could easily turn back into a wolf and mutilate them before they could reach their guns. Or if worst came to worst, I could make a quick getaway as Mist. "Lead the way," I said, careful to keep all emotion from my face. I followed the men down a short hallway. We arrived in a little room with a huge, roaring fireplace. There was a large pot of soup hung over the fire. It bubbled joyfully, and I could see the chunks of meat and vegetables floating in the brown broth. I wanted the soup so desperately. My body ached with hunger, but I knew it was a hunger meat and vegetables could never satisfy. "Take some soup," said the man who had called for the guns. "You're as pale and as cold as death." You have no idea." The man grabbed a wooden bowl from a nearby table and prepared to fill it with soup. I'm not hungry," I lied, feeling my entire body throb with pain as I said it. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." The man shrugged and filled the bowl. He grabbed a spoon, sat with the others, and began to eat. They sat in a semicircle of haphazardly placed wooden chairs around the fire. There were 7 of them in total. There was one chair in the semicircle left for an 8th person. I took a seat. "My name's Robert," said the man who had called for the guns after swallowing a disturbingly huge chunk of meat. "Victor," said another one of the older men. His beard was almost white, unlike Robert's, which had barely started to turn gray. His beard was stained with soup broth. "Creighton," said a younger man. He wasn't eating. He looked especially sad. "Dane," said a slightly older but still relatively young man. He was especially tall, lanky, and thin, but you'd never guess it by how much soup he was cramming into his mouth. I had to look away as he talked with his mouth full. "Charles," said a very old man. He had a bowl full of soup, but picked at it more than he actually ate from it. "Troy," said the youngest looking of the group. He had taken more soup than anyone else, but was eating it very slowly. He had a white streak in his hair. I wondered how he had gotten it. "Thomas," said a man who looked to be right between the ages of all the other men. He, too, was eating. It was odd, but I couldn't find any distinguishing characteristics about him. "I'm Clarissa," I told the men. I didn't know why, but I was beginning to trust them. "It's just really good to finally have someone else like us to talk to after all these years," said Robert. He was grinning ear to ear and barely seemed able to contain his childish enthusiasm. "So you're also—" I began, but was interrupted by Troy. "Yes, werewolves," Troy beamed, as did the others, except Creighton, who looked perpetually dejected. Ironically, there was nothing wolfish about their smiles. I opened my mouth to protest, but was interrupted by Troy again. "So how is it that you were able to transform at will?" he asked. This time I didn't even get a chance to open my mouth. "It might be because she's, well, a she," said Victor. He had found a spot up in the rafters and was dangling his feet off of the precarious ledge as he slurped his soup. "I thought I heard something once about the genetics of female werewolves making their transformation different. Is that true?" As he asked me this question, Victor leaned towards me, and I was afraid he would fall. "Sure," I shrugged noncommittally. "I told you," shouted Victor across the room at Dane. "Mmm," said Dane angrily, still with soup in his mouth. Worried I might blow the cover they had created for me, I shifted the conversation away from me. "How did you become werewolves?" I asked. "We came here from America about 5 years ago," said Charles. "We're a hunting group. We got bored of our usual hunting spots, so we decided to come here. In an unexpected twist, we ended up being hunted ourselves. Still don't know who the bastard was who bit us," said Dane, who had the courtesy to swallow before talking this time. "Excuse you," Charles frowned at Dane. "Anyway, we're still hunters, but now we turn into wolves every full moon." "Do you remember what happens when you're a wolf?" I asked Charles. "Yes, but not as well as when I'm a person. I mostly just remember the sensations of hunting, rather than what actually happens. Then I wake up and hear the next day with a half-eaten carcass of some villager sitting next to me. I would have been mortified by this in the past, but death was beginning to seem commonplace to me." Death really is rather commonplace, isn't it? Regardless, I'm not sure what expression I was wearing when Charles described the hunts, but the hunters must have thought I was horrified. "It's really not all that bad," Troy assured me, "once you get used to it." "I know," I said. I was about to go into a description of my time with you, but I decided that it was better if I let them think I was a werewolf. I needed to find somewhere to sleep. I didn't want to blow my cover by talking anymore, and dawn would be on its way soon. "Do you have somewhere I can sleep?" I asked. The question was directed at the group in general, but I looked at Charles as I asked it, as he seemed to be the leader of the group. "Well, there's the guest room," said Charles. In the guest room, skulls of animals, human and otherwise, lined the walls, trophies of their daytime and nighttime hunts. A large, beautiful, soft-looking bed stood in the middle of the room. It hurt to know that I couldn't sleep there. There was a wooden chest roughly the size of a coffin in one corner of the room. I opened it and began removing its contents. It was full of pillows, and there was a hacksaw at the bottom for some reason. The chest was a bit of a tight fit, but it would have to do. I slept surprisingly well. The next night, I met the men turned wolves outside the cottage, now in wolf form myself. I concentrated and looked into their thoughts. Only a tiny part of their human minds remained, and the rest was wolf. I would have to command them mentally a little bit more than I thought. The first group we met was a group of the villagers who had run away from me before. We came upon them in a patch of the woods closer to the village. They were talking about what to do about the vampire plague that had descended on Styria. They spoke about you, about us, with such hatefulness that I became enraged. I snarled, and we descended on them. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed the hunt. I felt that I should be disgusted, but I wasn't. In fact, I relished tearing their throats out. The next group we met was you. Chapter 16. To Transylvania. And that's what happened, said Clarissa, stopping to catch her breath. You know, I pointed out, you don't actually need to breathe now that you're dead. I need the breath to speak, she countered. I paused, realizing the truth of this. But you wouldn't need to catch it after you spoke, I responded. I would if I planned on saying something else, Clarissa replied in a stern voice. Both of you shut up, shouted Carmilla, who was nursing the finger that previously had a splinter in it. None of this is important. I'm surprised I even let you finish the story about the wolves. She stood up on the tree stump she had been sitting on and put her hands on her hips, but winced as the splinter finger touched her dress and let her right arm fall helplessly to her side. We need to find Laura. What about Van Helsing? Demanded Mina. He might leave the castle and kill more of our kind. A sadistic smile appeared on Carmilla's face. It seemed like a dark shape flitted over her eyes. He won't. A second's mental conference with the others confirmed me that we didn't want to know any more details. She had some kind of hold on all the animals around the castle. Then we had the idea to check the train station. Since Clarissa was still covered in grime and we had no way of cleaning her, we asked if she would stay in the woods while we went to the station. She happily obliged, saying that she felt at home there anyway. We discovered that a woman with a large box carrying special dirt for gardening had left on a train to Transylvania earlier that day. Transylvania? Exclaimed Mina and Lucy in unison after we had walked out of the train station to discuss our options. That's where Count Dracula was from, explained Lucy. He always made it sound so beautiful. Lucy's eyes became misty. I used to tease you about the way you romanticized him, Mina mused, staring up at the sky. A cloud was starting to obscure the moonlight. Then the mist in Lucy's eyes was covered by another mist, red this time. Her expression was unchanged, but there was rage underneath. Of course, then he drained my blood and never spoke to me again, she muttered, tonelessly. Regardless, we need to go there and find her, said Carmilla, voice burning with impatience. We nodded our agreement. We told the man at the train station that we were part of the same gardening program as Laura, and we would be traveling with our own earth boxes that night. We were in Transylvania the next night. We were greeted by a scene eerily similar to Styria, a small village with a huge castle on a hill behind it. We agreed to go around the village and head straight for the castle. If the villagers on Styria were on the lookout for vampires, the villagers in the place where the crafty vampire that had bitten my friends had come from would probably be even more watchful. It was an unpleasant trudge up the mountain, covered with dead trees at inconvenient and unfriendly angles. Doubly so because we were carrying our coffins with us. These were the makeshift coffins from the Styrian forest, but we had added lids and nails to keep the lids on. Miraculously, Carmilla did not get a splinter on our entire trek up the mountain. We were halfway up before daybreak. We set down our coffins and drifted into our death sleep. The next night, we reached the castle. It was even more imposing than the castle we first found Laura in. I don't think we should go in through the front door, said Cassie. The rest of us nodded. When we walked up to the back of the castle, we could see light streaming out of the window. In it, a familiar silhouette. "That's Laura," I said in a whisper. "Unmistakably," said Carmilla, matching my hushed tone. We began quietly scaling the wall in a mid-tempo lizard crawl. Eventually, Laura moved away from the window, and we quickened our pace a bit until we were out the window. Through the window, we could only see Laura, pacing around the room nervously. I tapped on the window to alert her of our presence. She turned around, startled at first, but a fanged smile spread over her face when she saw me. I smiled back. We were all now precariously balanced on the window ledge, so we were grateful when she let us in through the window. "I'm very glad to see you," she said once we were all inside. The sound of her familiar accent was extremely comforting to me. "But how did you know where I was?" she asked. I started to explain when my eyes fell on two familiar faces. One was the man who had brought me to the vampire who bit me. He lay dead on the floor in a pool of blood. The other was the woman who had bitten me. She lay dead on the floor with an arrow in her heart.